between punishing the people who got here on time or punishing the people who I suspect are still coming but haven't arrived yet. I think we'll reward the people who came on time by not waiting any longer. I'm Jan Walls, director of the David Lamb Center here, and welcome to our Pacific Region Forum, which is an irregular, not in the sense of content, but in the sense of timing, irregular, that is when we can get a hold of good people on relevant topics, then we grab them and bring them into these forums. Donald knows this very well because he's been attending our forums for probably a decade anyway, I believe. So he knows the rules for how our Pacific Region forums work, and they are his presentation itself will take place within an hour, okay, and that will leave us with a good half hour if you wish to engage in a dialogue, which is why we call it a forum rather than just a speech or a presentation. And you'll be welcome after his presentation to engage him with any kind of questions, comments, challenges. We only ask that you consume whatever food you've brought in now, and don't throw anything at him when we get into the discussion. Donald he comes at us with a very interesting background as someone who, as I just found out at lunch, he comes from a scientific undergraduate background and many years of experience in negotiating within business and government contexts. He is the author of a book that is in what I think it's third edition now, Marketing Your Product, co-author of Marketing Your Product. And his most recent work is called The Art of Global Thinking. The Art of Global Thinking. And that's too big a topic to cover in an hour presentation, so I've asked him to narrow it down to one aspect of global thinking, and the one he has chosen is East and West, competitive or complementary. Competitive or complementary. And this is a subject that is dear to my heart because I can't write on the blackboard here. I was going to write a Taiji tool. Taiji tool is basically, it's a circle. Which you could, if you took, I suspect, a typical Western approach, you could draw a line, a straight line from the top to the bottom of that circle and say, okay, here's East and here's West. And you could even borrow a famous line from a British author says, East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. Or you could take that line and you could make an inverted S out of it. And you could say, well, here is mostly East, and here is mostly West, but then as you move toward the middle, you find it's sort of half East, half West, and what you have when you do that is something which is simultaneously digital, in that it can be 0 or 1, and analogical, because it could be, it could be getting in the direction of 1, but not yet completely 1, or completely 1, which would be digital. Or it could be going in the direction of 0, but not yet completely 0, which is analogical. So it is both digital and analogical at the same time. So you can deal with opposites as complementary aspects of each other. If you're a sneaky old man like I am,
Same age.
It requires a certain amount of frustrated ambition and experience. But it's a really interesting concept to work with. So this is what we've asked him to talk about today. And we're not here to listen to me talk. We're here to listen to Donald. So
it was very interesting.
Welcome, Donald.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Gall. Conflicting or complementarity? I want to address that issue in a few minutes from now, but I'd like to start with a few stories, and then we'll get out of the mathematical scientific self. It's fun to do something different than what I'm being trained for. I have a young nephew, and he's learned very quickly, even at the age of 1, that if he wanted candy, he would go see his grandma to get some cocoa. And if he wanted some toys, he would see his father to get Spider-Man. I don't know the latest toys that exist for children's. And if he wanted a crossword puzzle, he goes sees his mother. You learn very quickly in age to sort of, who do I get to see to get certain things? And for those of you that work in the corporate world, that's where I'm from, the corporate world. I teach at universities on the sideline, but I'm from the corporate world. You learn also very quickly that if you want to get something from an accountant, bring the spreadsheet, bring the numbers, give me the bottom line, right? And if you want something from an engineer, they want to see the specs. Don't show me pictures, I want to see a spec. And if you had the person that's in communication, the arts, they like to see pictures, they like to see demonstrations, right? So, in one word, speak the language, okay? Now, there was an interesting experiment done at university a long time ago, and they wanted to understand why is that the case. And what they did is they took a class, hundreds of students, they give them a batteries of tests to see, to get students that have high need for power, to take charge, to control things, okay? Then they give a battery of tests to get a bunch of students that had a high need for affiliation, to associate with people. They brought these two groups of students, they brought them together in a class similar to this, put both of them together in the same class, and they would show them pictures, and then they would ask the student, how do you interpret those pictures? And here's one of the pictures they would show them. Like, there was a business context, there was two men like this, talking to each other, similar age, similar suit, and a sort of a neutral face, just like that. Okay? Like this. That was the picture shown right on the wall. Then as a student, what's happening over there? Okay? Those that had a high need for power said, he's telling him what he didn't do, what he should be doing, what he wants of him. The student that had a high need for affiliation said, they're talking about last night. They're talking about the lunch they had together. Now, which one is correct? Okay. Which one is correct? Your needs, what you need, makes you see the world in a certain way. Okay? Same picture, same context, same class, but those that have high need for power saw one controlling or telling the other one to do something, and those with a high need for affiliation saw somebody talking about last night's party. Okay? In the same way, cultures at a time provide us with our social values that provides a standard by which we judge things. And let me give you a similar story. In 1982, Air Florida took off from Washington, D.C. A few minutes later, it crashed in the Potomac River. Now, before the takeoff, the co-pilot, it was snowing that day. It was very cold and snowing. And the co-pilot kept telling the pilot, "Ooh, look at the snow building on the aircraft. Oh, look at this. There's a bit of ice, I think. Look, I think there's ice over there in the aircraft." The pilot would say, "Don't worry about this. This baby will take off. Don't worry about it." Now, the pilot was from Florida. The co-pilot was from the north part of the States. Okay? Who understood snow? Who knew about snow? And the co-pilot kept repeating, "I think we should go to the ice. Really, there's a lot of snow accumulating on the wing." They took off. The aircraft was not able to lift high enough, crashed, and killed something like 85 people in the Potomac River. Took out the black box, studied what happened, what were the problems, and the conclusion was that the co-pilot, the conclusion by Americans, was that the co-pilot was not assertive enough. It was too submissive. Okay? Hence, starting 1982, I come from the transportation industry, so I'm very well aware of that example. They put up an assertive course for all co-pilots so that when they know something is happening, they should exercise that. Now, this was presented to Deborah Hannon, communication specialist, presented that problem to an international class. In the international class was a bunch of people from Japan. One of the Japanese students raised his hand and said, "Would it have not been as easy to teach the pilot to listen better?" See, when you look at East versus West, in the East, in the West, we're known as the individuals, individualistic, and the label put to the Eastern societies is collectivism. Now, when you look at the difference between that, Dr. Wall says it best in a book stated by Success. In the West, the focus is on the individual. In collective society, the focus is on the relationship between individuals. Okay? In the West, the focus is on the individual, and in the East, the focus is on the relationship between individuals. Now, individualism versus collectivism make us see the world slightly different, gives a different accent. For American, it made sense to train your co-pilot to be more assertive. And for someone from the East, it made sense to train them to listen a bit better. Both solutions are fine, but imagine if we could take a bit from both. Are we conflicting, or are we complementary? Well, we know, we hear about conflict all the time. But where there are problems lies opportunities. And personally, I like to look at the complementarities of the different cultures rather than look at the conflicts that exist between both. And let me talk about that. I'm going to do one ad from my book, where I talk about the complementarity of the East and the West. When I started to write the book 7 years ago, my interest was not in looking at the East and the West. My interest was, I was teaching part-time at university in the evenings, but my day job was planning airports. Now I'm executive director for the Societe of Economic Development, but at that time I was planning airports. And in teaching theory, I was always interested and I was always wondering, why do we say one thing but do something different? I would go back, I'd look at the managers around me, they all knew the theory, they all knew what they were supposed to be doing, but did something different. Later, I read a book by Daniel Goleman that talked about emotional intelligence, where he looked at successful people, either athletes or in management, in leadership roles. And he says that emotional intelligence was the key ingredient to success. We may know what to do, but if we don't have emotional intelligence, sometimes we just can't carry it out. Okay? Now, emotional intelligence is defined as being in touch with yourself, being in touch with others, and managing your impulse. I will come back to that later, but keep that in mind as I go through the conversation. Being in touch with yourself, being in touch with others, and the management of your impulse. This forms the model by where I then relate later the complementarities of East and West. Being from science, I'm always curious as to why things happen and why are we like this. So I will give you an overall simplification of the evolution that took place, or the difference in evolution that took place between the East and the West. Oops. That's a hunter. Okay? Now, Western societies, that is Europe, come from hunting societies. Now, this is, for those of you familiar with Joseph Campbell, that's where that material comes from. This is an overall simplification. He only wrote about 58 books that I'm going to put in 2 minutes over here about this. The Western people come from hunting societies. As you can see, hunting is dangerous. Don't forget, in ancient time, a wound or a cut, you could die from that. It's a very dangerous economic activity. I like to look at it as the form of economy that existed then. It's either you or the animals that die. Okay? And in such economies, let's say in hunting societies, it's you or the animal dies. It favors, and it was mainly men that hunt, people that are willing to take risk, to take charge. People that are willing to distinguish themselves. Now imagine, while a deer goes by, or a horse, or a bear, being with your partner and say, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. You'd miss your deer, right? And the guy that gets up and go is a guy that's favored. It favored the risk takers. Okay? In hunting society, though, what evolved is the concept of duality, where there's a separation between you and the animal, between you and the group, between you and nature. Because it was either you or the animal, you or death. Hence the concept of duality that evolved from the Eastern. Hence, now, you could see that in religion also. It's only in Christianity where there's a separation between Caesar and God. Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. Okay? Now let's make the comparison with the Eastern societies. But before we go to that, hence that's why in the West we have this famous saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Just do it by Nikes. Okay? George Bush said what lately? You are with us or against us. Beautiful example of duality. You're with us or against us, right? Now, the Eastern societies are from planting societies. In planting societies, if you put the seed in the ground before it's time, you could get a frost and the seed will die. If you put it too late, it will not have time to grow. If you pick the fruit before it's time, well, you could have a grain that weighs 25 grams, or you could have a grain or a fruit that weighs 50 grams within 2-3 weeks by the time you pick it up in September. Okay? In planting society, the individuals has very little influence on the environment. In planting societies, individuals have to learn to move with the environment. Not before, not after. Okay? You have to be in tune with the environment. It therefore favors elder people that have been around for a long time, that understood the cycle of nature, the cycle of time. Okay? Suppression of individual impulse was favored in planting societies. You could not run and just do it. While in Western societies, you would not discourage suppression of individual impulse. You wanted the individual to take off, get away, and go and hunt. Okay? So in planting societies, it favors the concept of interrelated, interconnected, interdependent. So to be in accord with the natural order became the bottom line way of dealing in the East. In Hinduism or Buddhism, separation is an illusion. You have an ego, you have fear and desire that separates you from one's soul, the soul of the world. Separation is an illusion. Okay? In the West, it's the opposite. Separation is reality. To think of yourself as the same essence of God is blasphemous in the West. Just the opposite of Eastern way of thinking. Oneness is about everything. If you're not in touch with your soul, it's your problem because you got an ego that prevents you from being one with one soul. Okay? In China, the natural order was explained by Confucius as there are 4 seasons, 5 different elements, as there are different characteristics to these elements, as a ruler, the ruler is different, the father is different, the mother is different, the sons are different. If you understand your role and you act according to your role, harmony will be attained and you will be in accord with the natural order. Hence, in Asia, or specifically in China, values such as diligence, obligation, respect, regard, duty, propriety, wisdom evolved and were valued. While in the West, we evolved value like self-reliance, distinction, taking risk, individualism. See the difference? Okay. Now, Confucius was exported, let's say, to China, to Japan in the 5th and 6th century. In Japan, Wa for harmony stands for accommodation, conformity, compromise. But it's funny how you can tell that the East and the West is a beautiful expression in the West that we say that the nail that protrudes, just the opposite. The squeaky wheel gets the attention in the West, okay? In Japan, there's an expression that says, the nail that protrudes gets hammered in. Bang. All about the same thing, okay? The nail that protrudes gets hammered in. That expresses in many ways the difference that exists between East and West. Now, I want to go to the corporate world and how these differences apply to the corporate world. Then I will talk about how this applies to us at the personal level. But before I go to the corporate world and talk about these differences and how this applies and how we can bring them together, I want to introduce one more concept here, which is the mechanical order, and which happened to the people that come from the Western world. In Europe, and it's because of science, I will relate that to science. In Europe, in 1250, Europe woke up and says, wow, there's another world out there. Can't believe this. Sounds great. I'd like to get a bit more of the spice and so on. There's mirrors. And Europe started to explore. In 1250, Europe was something like 500 to 800 years behind Asia in terms of technology. It didn't matter which field you look in, military, wealth, literacy, the arts, Europe was quite far behind. Europe started to explore the world around 1500 and caught up to the rest of the world around 1750. In 1750, 33% of the goods, all goods in the world produced in China, Europe was producing almost nothing. By 1860, the middle of the Industrial Revolution, in Europe, Europeans were producing 56% of the world good, and by 1928, the West, okay, by then the States have entered the pictures, were producing 84% of the world goods. Okay, that's the difference. What happened? Industrial Revolution took place in Europe, alongside with science. A lot of historians here get upset if you say science gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. It's not necessarily the case. It's usually Industrial Revolution that took place. Technology would come first and science follow, but let's call it the evolved parallel. Now, what happened is that in keeping with the notion of duality, in keeping with the separation that you and nature is different, me individual is different, Descartes, a French philosopher, Cartesian philosophy, came up with, the famous guy that says, I think, therefore I am, but he came up with the philosophy that nature is composed of dead, inert matter governed according to mathematical laws. Nature was conceived as dead, inert matter governed according to mathematical laws. And Europeans started to try to discover these mathematical laws that govern nature. Hence, the concept of science, of isolating the natural phenomena to observe and measure it, came into being. Okay? Now, without going to science, where it's done, this concept of isolating, observing, and measuring in Europe was applied to everything, not only to physics. Drop an apple, see how much time it takes, go to the top of the mountain, drop an apple, see how much time it takes, go to sea level, drop an apple. Here, we come up with a mathematical law that explains gravity. It was also applied to biology, it was applied to psychology, and it entered also the business world around 1860. Okay? Hence, the concept of mass production started in Europe, where you took a job, divided in different tasks, where people did different things. It evolved until Henry Ford took it on, where he then put a car, a chassis, into a conveyor belt that went along, and people would do a different job for everything. One would put the bolts, the other one would put the windshield, the other one would put the tires, and so on. It was a pretty revolutionary concept. Those that did not enter mass production just die off. Those that stay with craftsmanship die, essentially. The concept of mass production, though, produced a lot of goods, but it was also applied to management. Management now was divided according to marketing, manufacturing, finance, human resource, supplies, and so on. Marketing was divided according to sales, advertising, pricing, product, research, and so on. The whole notion of isolate, observe, measure was applied manufacturing, and it was applied at the management level. Then you came with an accounting system that would measure all of these difference, return on investment, and so on. For those of you that are in the business world will know what that means, to measure each of those activities. Okay? The end result of that was that we had a 50-fold increase in productivity from the beginning of 1900 to now, and a 25-fold increase in real salary. It was a success story. It created a middle class that did not exist before. The distribution of wealth was flat with an inverted T like this, with a few people at the top and everybody else at the bottom. Now, the distribution of wealth is like this. So it created a whole middle class as a result of that. Europeans look at that as bad, and they say, hey, that works, and apply it to everything. But pushed to the extreme, it became a problem. Okay? Pushed to the extreme, that's when it becomes a problem. And I'll give some live example in a short while. But it gave rise to what we call in the West, or Tarnas, a philosopher from Harvard, said the mechanical order. You look at life as governed by and can be understood according to mathematical laws. It was such a success that people came to believe that you could understand everything. And by understanding, you could control it, and by controlling it, you could become wealthier, and so on, so on. Okay? Now, in looking at how this applies to the corporate world, I look at mainly Japanese and Korean companies compared to North American companies. Only because if you were to compare Chinese companies, I would compare them with French companies. It's a hub and spoke system type of things. But North American companies have a board that then deter the management to professional managers, just like Japan does and Korea does. Okay, they have very similar corporate structure in terms of decentralization, centralization. They have similar corporate success. Also, Japan and the States have very similar GDP per person. Okay, wealth distribution, very similar standards of environment standards and literacy and so on. So that's why I made a comparison mainly between the Japanese and the North American companies. In comparing these companies, it is quite interesting that Americans, I'll read to you how individualism versus, let me show you individualism versus collectivism and what it means in terms of how corporate world work with this. In Japan, the Tokyo Chamber of Commerce defines business as relations between employees are just like those within a family. The young and old help one another and consult together in both good times and bad. They are enveloped in a mist of affectionate feeling. Now, a North American hearing a definition of business like that would say, yeah, give me a break. Okay? And if you look at BC Chamber mandate or business goal here, their mandate is to convey to government and to the public the concern of its members. That's the mandate of the BC Chamber of Commerce. Okay? Me and you. The world of business, we tell the government what's important for business, and we tell the public the interest that you have in supporting us. Okay? Very different definition here of the Chamber of Commerce for Vancouver versus the one in Tokyo. Okay? Hence, one of the big differences between East and West in terms of corporate collectivism versus individual is in North America, we reward the individual, and as you know, in Japan, they reward the group. Okay? That's one major difference. In looking at the mechanical order, which evolved with time just recently in North America, a lot of you know that we negotiate everything, and we have contract for everything, and we have policies for everything. Ford Company, 1980, had 450 different manuals of rules and 280 different job classification. Everything is well defined. Okay? The reason we know that is because the car companies were having problem in competing against a Japanese company. Nissan at that time had 5 different job classification and 5 book of rules. Huge difference, right? That's why also in North America, we have 1 lawyer for every 360 citizens. And in Japan, they have 1 lawyer for every 7,800 Japanese citizens. Hence, one of the big difference in North America in comparing Japanese with Asians is that American negotiate a contract while Asian or Japanese, most Asian, negotiate a relationship. Big difference. Okay? Remember, the hunters like to differentiate themselves. American play poker. The Japanese play chess when it comes to corporate world. Okay? So there are some difference. Now, let's talk about the corporate world. If we ask you, what's more important for the viability and survival of a company? Profit or market share? We could talk for one day and counter-argue and argue that market share is more important or profitability is more important. Okay? I've been in that world for a long time, and I can give you good argument for profit, and I can give you very good argument for market share. The one you choose has very little to do with business logic or business philosophy. It has a lot more to do with your values. The Japanese have always looked down on merchants, historically speaking. They look at them as vulgar, grasping, selfish. Hence, the Japanese have always feared market share, because most corporate managers in Japan come from the samurai class. Soldiers like territory. Hence, when you do a survey in Japan, you ask what's more important, profit or market share? 87% of the Japanese will say market share. Same survey in North America, you get 20% of executives saying market share. Most of them will say profit. Now, don't forget, in North America, our theory comes from Adam Smith that justifies profit via if you work for yourself because you think and you want something for yourself, you will do something good for others in order that you can profit. Okay? So it's very easy in North America to justify making profit. You will make profit when you do something good for others, therefore it will be good for yourself. Adam Smith's theory, for those of you familiar with that. Hence, it has very little to do with business logic, but this is just a demonstration to show how your cultural values dictate which of those business logic you will apply to yourself. Okay. Now, we could say Japanese companies have been very successful and American companies have been successful. Why bother changing? And I'm not here saying we should go right in the middle of those. Okay? But it is time for a change. It is time to take a bit from each of those. And now let me tell you why. Mass production, in the era of mass production, if you go back 100 years ago, if you could make a product that was reliable at a cheap price, you were guaranteed to sell it. It was an era dominated by engineers. People needed everything. Sweaters, shirt, central heating, cars. The companies that were competitive were the ones that could produce it at a cheap price, and you could sell it. Hence, in those days, the beginning of the last century, I hate that we're in 2000 now. We used to be able to say the beginning of the century. Now I say the beginning of the last century. The competitive companies were the ones with plants and equipment. That's what gives you your edge, your competitive edge. Okay? And all you needed to do is come up with a way of producing something and observe people. You could see arms move, putting the car together. You know, everybody was there, push a tire, push the next tire, push the next tires. And you could see that. There was no problem. But starting in the 60s, with the Volkswagen Beetle, that's when it came into the market. For the first time, lifestyle takes over. Okay? As the dominating force that controls the business world. As a result of that, you need by far much more information. If you ask the executive at General Electric, what's the most important thing that a customer looks for when buying appliance? The executive at General Electric, this was done, and that's why I'm giving you that example, will say Customers look for workmanship and performance when they buy an appliance. When you ask a customer, what do you look for when you buy an appliance? The customer will say, appearance and cleanability. Today's world, when I buy a watch, I don't ask if it's going to keep the time right. I take that for granted. But the watch has to say something about my lifestyle. Okay? That's the difference that we're in. Hence, the age of information takes place around the 1960s. Okay? But, in the reason, if you don't have the proper information, you're going to go build, 80% of the time, the company goes down, is because they fail to understand what the customer wanted. Not necessarily that you made a bad product. But if you promoted workmanship when they wanted appearance, you missed the boat and then went bankrupt. Hence, you need information. So 80% of the time, you fail to understand the market, you went bankrupt. Now, you got the product, you're saying the right things, you get to the shop, or you go by to a store, and you see this lady on the telephone, and you're trying to get attention. And she's on the phone, don't bother me, don't you see I'm speaking with my friends? 68% of the time, people will leave a business, it's because they treat it with indifference. So it's not enough to have the right product at the right place at the right price, but once you get to that retail outlet, you have to treat the customer with. Okay? So it's not only an age of information, but people expect a lot out of you. They expect value added. They expect new innovations and so on. Now, why is it that in North America we're not getting that? So we're in a different era. Yeah, it's nice to say we're in a different era. Everybody knows that. But what does that really mean, that new era? We're in an era now that we need a commitment from our employees, more than before, to provide the information that's needed to do the right things. We need the commitment also in order that they interact with the customers in the right way, or else you will lose your customers and you don't have a choice. It's no longer like it used to be, that you could just watch somebody put the tire on the car, and if they stop putting the tire, you go say, hey, you stop putting the tires there, get back to work. You can't do that now. Okay, commitment is within. Information is in your head. You cannot watch that. So we're really in a different era. Now, what happened in North America is that the mechanical order created a position where everything is dictated by systems within the companies. Like if I take back the Ford, where you have so many job classifications, so many manual controlling everything, what happens in such a situation, as Peter Drucker, for those of you that don't know, Peter Drucker is the guru of the business world, says that people spend 90% of their time looking inside the company for answers instead of looking outside. It's like driving a car, looking at the gadgets in your car 90% of the time. How long are you going to survive without an accident? Okay? These systems create indifference in companies. And that indifference translates to the fact that when a customer comes in, they treat it with indifference also. Also, under the scientific concept, evolved the notion of universal principles. North American believes that their concept of human right applies to the world, right? It comes from Christianity, who also believed that it was the same God for everybody else. And we just went from holistic universals to atomic universal, but it's the same concept. That notion of universality, that's a hard word to say, translate to, in the world of business, economic utility, where effectiveness and efficiencies prevail over everything else above human relations. In North America, in the last 25 years, 30 years, in the name of utility, economic utility, we've been restructuring. Another word for those of you we know very well called firing people. Here's a piece, we'll put that over there. Here's a piece, we'll put over there. It has created a tremendous amount of cynicism, the end result of that. The end result of that is that in 1960, 60% of the population trusted most people in North America. By the late 90s, 60% of the population did not trust most people. Okay? 70% of the executive believe that their staff have trust in them. When surveyed, less than 20%, less than 27% of the staff have trust in management. That type of cynicism does not translate very well to good service and relaying information. Now imagine looking at the Asian commitment toward the companies in terms of loyalty, respect, and so on. There's a lot that we could take from the Asian way of doing business. Okay. That's where there's some complementarity there. However, let's not push things to the extreme here. By taking the extreme in North America, let me give you also what the extreme in Asia can do. Business is based on personal relationship, for example. I'll just give one. Okay? That means in Asia, you do business because you know someone. Period. Not because you have a contract, but because you know someone. If you look at Japan, you deal with people you know. Hence, the distribution system in Japan is you give a product to somebody you dealt with in the past. And then that person gives their product to somebody else they dealt in the past. By the time it gets to the consumer, it costs much more. In North America, a product that costs you $1, by the time it gets to the person who buys it, you add 70 cents to this, it will cost $1.70, okay, for each dollar. In Japan, a product that costs you $1 to produce, by the time it gets to the consumer, because of all of these intermediate that goes by, it will cost you $3. Hence, in Japan, on average, products and service will cost you 40% more in North America as a result of this relationship type of business. So there's a cost at personal relationship, and there's a cost at mechanization. There's a cost at each extremes. Patronage in Japan is as a result of these personal relationships, hence the bad debts. But it's very difficult for Japanese to fire a member from the family. They know that. They are fairly well aware of the distribution and its inefficiencies. They're fully aware of that. But when you deal with someone at the family level, it is very difficult for them to clean up the house as we do in North America under the concept of economic utility. Hence, they could also, in part, take a bit of this economic utility and apply it. Because the existing distribution system in Japan, you could take 90% of it out and it could perform to perfection. But there's a huge cost at keeping everybody else around. Okay? So there's a cost at a bit of both.
Are you familiar with a show that aired recently from the U.S. on China, and economic restructuring in China? And they gave a comparison of both rural and what would be considered a small city of about 4.5 million people. And in the rural areas, for 20 years, they've gone towards free market agriculture. And they saw a great disparity. Some people were quite successful, and other people were having real problems surviving. In the cities right now, it is so massive, the iron rice bowl is disappearing, and tens, even hundreds of thousands of people are being laid off from factories where they have jobs for life. And it was a documentary style program, just amazing to see the impact on people. And there's a lot of unrest, obviously.
That's right.
There's very little to repress.
That's right. That's right. And in Japan, since the bubble burst, they've been aware of that, but they've been very slow at doing something about it because it's very difficult for them to kick somebody from. Would you kick your child out? Sorry, can't afford you. You know.
The interesting thing in Japan is that although there are a lot of people living on the streets,
Mm-hmm.
go to a place where people are living on the streets, it's not like it's immaculate.
That's right.
They're hospitable places where people live. And it's a really amazing contrast.
Yeah.
The way we see things.
Yeah.
I think this is a great comment, but I think we need to get you through
Okay.
your formal presentation, and then we'll follow up on that. That's okay with you.
Thanks. That was great. Thanks a lot. It was good. Let me now relate this complementarity to the personal, at a personal level. Now, I've talked about the corporate, and I think you could see by those examples, when we're pushing to the extreme, there's a cost to it. And if we could borrow a little bit from each, how much better it will be. But let's go now, what it implies for us at a personal level. And I'll talk about leadership within the corporate world. I come from the corporate world, but it applies to many. When I say this about leadership, it applies to you in the community, in your family, these things here. But the leader in the West is defined as the person who sets direction, motivates the troops, and makes a decision. Very fitting with individualism in it. He's the man or the woman that sets the direction, motivates the troops, and makes a decision. In Japan, a leader is defined as the person who watches over the harmony of the company and the maintenance of good relationship outside the company. Very different. I know in my role as executive director, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one is the most important. I would tell you both are very important. But the prevalence in North America is to set direction, motivate the troops, and make decisions. Okay. Now, when we talk about leadership, if there's a topic where there's been research done, it's on leadership. And it's just as an end. On leadership, it's a topic that's interesting in a lot of things. And you will see a lot of things, like the leader is a person that provides vision. It's a person who sets structure. It's a person that, the beautiful strategies, energy, cultures, and so on and so on. It's the man or the woman, there are fatal flaws to leadership also. It cannot be aloof, arrogant, abrasive, betrayal of trust, and so on. But the key thing the things that keeps returning when you look at leadership across time and culture is that it's the person that has a good self-image of themselves, that's willing to seek advice from others, and the key one here, have a balanced ego. Now look at emotional intelligence and what it says. And this was done independently, because emotional intelligence was done on top athletes, top so on. Emotional intelligence says the ability to be in touch with oneself, the ability to be in touch with others, and the ability to manage one's impulse or manage one's ego. Okay. Goldman, in his research, said that when looking at successful leaders, we've always put too much importance on IQ, and more should be put on EQ. IQ is something that we measure, right? It comes from the scientific era. We love to isolate and measure things, and because we measure it, we understand it, we think that that's important. I hate talking science. I mean, that's where I come from. But let's not push it to the extreme. Okay? But that's why we've been paying attention to IQ, because it's easy to understand. But successful leaders had one thing in common. 90% of them had one thing in common, and that was EQ. When you look at successful athletes, the same thing. Perseverance requires you can manage your impulse. It requires that you know where you want to go. And it requires that you work with others at the same time. Okay? Now, should we be surprised? Albert Einstein once said, "I never discovered anything with my rational mind." Mark Twain once said, "Courage is resistant to fear, mastery of fear, not the absence of fear." Now, managing your impulse is not about not having impulse, it's about managing them. Yeah? And when we look in the East, Zen proverb says, "Knowing others is understanding. Knowing self is wisdom." The hints were all there. It's been known for a long time. Goldman was able to make it popular, understandable to a large percentage of the population. But where's the link to that? We shouldn't be surprised, because in part, when we're born with two complementarity needs, which is needs that are the same side of the coin: autonomy and attachment. Think of it of a child. If a child, when born, didn't have the need for attachment, he or she would quickly run away from the parents. In ancient time, tiger would be around, he or she was a meal. Without the need for attachment, you would have not survived. You needed your parents to protect you for a very long time. But by the same token, you had, and this is known now by doctors, that at the age of 8 months, around 8 months to 18 months, the child separates, starts exploring. He or she has a need for autonomy. And without that need to explore, you wouldn't learn the skills that you need to survive later in life, to provide for yourself and provide for others. Okay? That dual need, it seems, in the West, we put the attention on the need for autonomy, individualism, distinctiveness, self-reliance, and so on. In the East, they put the need on attachment, collectivism, harmony, attachment, obligation, moving of the surrounding, moving of the group, being attuned to what others are doing. Okay? Emotional intelligence is about being in touch with yourself, managing your impulse, and being in touch with others. At the base of successful leaders, successful athletes, successful musician, a person that does well in the communities is emotional intelligence. Hence, that's why I say there's a complementarity between East and the West, in the sense that the values that have evolved from the West helps us be in touch with ourselves. The values that have evolved from the East helps us be in tune with others. I didn't talk much about spirituality because we have limited time. But as in that sense, at the level of emotional intelligence, there's a large complementarity in Eastern and Western values. Either the corporate level, here in my book I talk both how this relates to leadership here, and how at the leadership we put different importance on certain aspects of the corporate world, but for all intents and purposes, the values of the East and West complement each other in the sense that they provide for greater emotional intelligence. And if that's one of the basic ingredients for success, it's worth looking at both, essentially. That's my message, whether it's at the corporate level or individualistic level. So I'll open...
Do that for a second.
That's it?
Great.
That's it. Great.
Okay. We'll open up the floor to questions, comments. Sir?
Could you leave that up?
Yeah, good. You want to leave that up? You can.
Oh, okay.
We can
This
still
one?
talk.
Yeah.
While we're moving.
Yes. Sir?
Orson Welles had a film that was just on the other night, Lady from Shanghai. And he used the word lady from Shanghai. It was supposed to be a woman that came from Shanghai, though she was English American. And Shanghai was used sort of in a joking way to mean accommodating yourself to evil. And he asks in the movie, he asks, what's the most evil place on the earth? And he says it's Macau. And he doesn't say anything about what Macau is or anything, but at the time he did it at 47, Macau, from what I was reading about it, was controlled by Portugal, and it was controlled by about 3 or 4 different places at the same time, and so that in the sense that it was a total black market. So in a sense that it was the most evil place on the earth, but you can't actually call it evil anymore, because since it was controlled by so much by a black market, there was sort of no market and no evil, no good. And so I think he was making a joke. And I see that as what makes the connection between East and West. If you get to a point where there's a black market and that there's no distinction between the the lady from Shanghai or the lady from, I mean, you can make the same joke from, about China, it's Chinatown Jake. It's the same idea. I'm sure someone could make the same movie, in Hong Kong and say it's Vancouver Jake. I don't know. But once you get to the point where someone's black market is another person's white market and you don't know the difference, I think you get to a point, and as I find it, it's not the worst place in the world in the sense it's the best place in the world.
It's interesting, like Fujisawa, the founder of the Honda motor company, once said that Japanese and American executive are 95% the same, but differs in all important respect, i.e., he put it, it was 95% similarities and 5% difference, and it's not a bad ratio. When it comes to black markets, it's not particular to Asia nor North America, they're everywhere. I think, we share much more in common. We've talked about a difference here. Let's not forget, we share by far more in common than we have difference. Difference helps us understand. In some ways, difference, I find, why I wrote this, and I start to look at these, is that difference helps us put in perspective our own values. But we share by far more in common with the Asian than we have difference. And black market, I think, is nothing particular of today, nor the past, nor the difference between East and West at all. So I think what your comment is, it's correct, yeah. And if they were to do it here, you'd have the same type of comments.
But you're also using, and Orson Welles is using, a value-laden term to describe phenomena.
There's another...
It's what in general semantics, we distinguish between snarl words and purr words. Black market is a snarl word. There are people today who would call that the unofficial economy, or the unofficial market, or the unofficial economy. I mean, there are non-snarl words that could describe a similar phenomenon, but we have to be aware of value-laden terms. And I think whether or not you use a snarl word will be determined by whether or not you get a piece of the action. And I think people who do not benefit from it will tend to use snarl words.
See, I come from the point of view that society is a criminal conspiracy. And if you start from that point of view, that society is a criminal conspiracy, then
makes sense.
In a sense, it has a I mean, I heard maybe this is wrong, I heard in the Southeast Asia and stuff, they use pidgin English to change goods. And so at some point, if you're with drugs and other things, there's got to have this lowest common denominator that on any market. And so that I would, in a sense, I don't have a term for it, what I would call black and white market. I don't distinguish between black and white market. I'm using the term black market to mean any market almost. Whereas most of the way you talk seems like all you were talking about is the white market in Japan and North America, right? You weren't talking about any market. You were talking about just the white market.
Well, in the sense that you're using it now, in the sense of the existing markets as we know, yeah, correct.
Because
I'm not talking about the black markets, no.
The white market changes relative to the black market.
Personally, I've never made a distinction between black market in Asia or the West. They exist everywhere.
You find orthodox systems and unorthodox or counter-orthodox or extra-orthodox systems in every society in the world. And the way I understood is, the way I'm understanding his message is that it is dangerous to go to the extremes of trying to see things only in black and white, and that the vast majority of things that work are shades of gray, which implies blending of the two. I think that's the virtue that I see coming out of his presentation. He didn't mention, for example, the role of the Yakuza in creating the bubble in Japan, but that's a whole other story. Manu, I think you had your hand up.
I have a couple of things to ask. In talking about the rise of Europe, you didn't mention as Gunther, I think it was Gunther Frank who wrote about the rise of the West came on the backs of ripping off South American gold, and that really made a large impact on how and why it surpassed Asia at the time, and his book, I forget the title, talks to that quite well. But I think we need to keep that in mind, that it didn't just happen because of technology alone. That's the first thing.
In talking about the rise, in my book, and talking about the rise of Europe, I mentioned, we had the Reformation, we had the Renaissance, we had another exploration, and under exploration, yes, I do talk a little bit about the fact that they'd opened up markets, and there was some exploitation.
That might satisfy this guy here, by the way.
Yeah, but given the time restraint, I didn't go into that detail. I was in order to get to the mechanical order that makes us mechanization of our industries. But
the next thing I wanted to ask, if I might, when you were talking about the comparison between the East and the West, do you address, and I am looking forward to reading your book, I've got a reserve of the library, but someone else wants it better than that. Collaboration, that is, you talk about the Eastern way and the Western way and the problem, but do you discuss again what happens through collaboration and how those things are resolved in positive or negative,
in the book, I give practical examples of how we can implement the both system. I give us, as a matter of fact, the Chrysler example of. But one of the things we must not forget. If you live in a culture for your first 12 years of life, you never can take away those social values. They are part of you. It's your jumping board. It's your standard by which you judge things. Okay, it's very important to keep that in mind when trying to implement, let's say, Eastern ways of doing things. In the example I use, I talked about Chrysler, who was having a lot of problem competing against Honda and Nissan and so on. And they did a study, MIT did a study, and they were saying, well, it's cultural, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it. And when MIT finished the studies, they said, oh, no, it's not. There's a lot of things that you could take from the Eastern way of doing things, and you could employ, and it would help the company. In the late 80s, Chrysler was making $200 profit per car by adopting some of the Japanese practice, which was to put suppliers, designers, manufacturers in the same room.
The conditions which allowed for the European ships to come to North America derive from a very important example of Sino-Western communication. If you read the book called 1421, the year that China discovered the world, you'll see that Columbus used a map which can be traced back to Admiral Zheng He in the Ming Dynasty, 1421, because he made it all the way to the north coast of the northeast coast of America. But if he didn't have that map, those lines, eventually it wouldn't have been opened up so soon, I think. Interesting book.
So it's China's fault.
It's called It's China's fault. Yeah, because ultimately everything is.
I wanted a discussion on the basis of the point that he wasn't given. You were saying, I had a question like, well, not a point, like, okay, you know that since humans are human nature, like you were saying in our human, we want to have as a child, right? So how does that play in the role of like a social structure between Japan and the Western field? Because the Western, individuality, or what's the other word you use?
Collectivism.
Collectivism. That's right. So as we're greedy, naturally formed greed. We want. But why is it that in North America, we appraise that? We think that that's a good thing. And in the Eastern world, we think, okay, if I go up, my neighbor comes up with me. My others suffer. They're all competitive. Just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Fukuyama says that 80% of our behavior can be explained through self-interest, and the other 20% is explained by social values. That said, it's not that Asians don't love their neighbors more because they're collectivists. Okay? And a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the Asian are maybe not as aggressive. And if you just look at Japanese Canons, the company Canon, their corporate goal is to beat Xerox. Okay? Now, we may look more greedy because we think we grab something for ourselves, but don't underestimate the group of saying this is important for us. As a company, we're going to beat everybody in the world. may look less greedy because you're doing it as a team, but it doesn't change the fact that 80% of our behavior can be explained by our basic needs.
In the team aspect of things, though, isn't the team more stronger and can go farther if it's just an individual?
Well, that depends, and I will relate that to corporate world in that case. Okay? In the corporate world, individualism gives rise more to entrepreneurship and mega breakthrough in terms of innovations. In team, you have what's called Kaizen, very important small step at a time, in terms of a lot of improvements. When you look at the numbers of innovation and patents per 100,000 in population, Japan right now is equal with, is more than Canada, okay? But not that much more. So on things you can measure, not necessarily, okay? It depends on what field that you're looking at, what type of inventions.
I have to point out something else. You say that in the East they believe that corporations, people are basically good and whatever. You said something like that, right?
Sure.
I have to point out that one of the greatest raging debates that has been going on in Chinese philosophy since the 4th century BC is whether human beings at birth are essentially good or essentially evil. The Confucianist and the Mention tradition says, at the beginning people are basically good. And if we merely educate them, they will stay good and they won't go bad. The Xunzi tradition says that at birth people are basically evil. We have to educate them to make them decent people. So it's by no means, it's been a raging debate for a long, long time.
But we do have that greed naturally. Like, I mean, as a child, the first thing, like, say, in kindergarten, we all remember, oh, I have my turbo shoes, I'm faster than you.
Yeah.
You know, naturally. And that, we don't, like, even if you're a parent, you don't teach that to your kid. You're better than the next kid. No, you show them the discipline, you show them
the urge to survive has to be. When it appears in the individual, it appears as individual selfishness. When it appears for the good of the species, it becomes a virtue. So survival of the species is a necessary precondition for individuals to be born. So,
society gives you the values by which you judge those things.
Sir, you had your hand up.
I was just wondering about, when you're speaking about the art of global thinking, are you talking about, it's good to combine them for business that's starting now and coming up, or are you talking just in general business operating, say, in North America or in Asia? Because obviously right now with the internet and I guess what they say the global economy, everything's more and more together. Companies are working with cultures from all over the world, and obviously understanding both sides of business from the East and the West is definitely going to benefit companies that are operating in this new economy. But are you saying that this would be crucial for, say, even a company in Japan, say, that's all Japanese, dealing with strictly domestic market, if they take certain aspects from American business and apply it there? I won't say North America, because usually in North America it's multicultural right away, but obviously in a place like Japan, there's a good chance that a lot of businesses are operating 100% of Japanese and with domestic markets. So I'm wondering, you know what I mean?
The purpose of the book, is yes, but it would apply to Japanese companies or North American, let's say. Well, multiculturalism over there, but if you go to Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you would find a lot of very typical North American character over there, right? In Vancouver, we are multiculturalism, and in Toronto and Montreal, the big cities. But if you go to the prairies, you'll find. But will that book apply to prairies? Yes. Okay. In the sense that I talk about the information age. Information is in the person's mind. Innovation is in the person's mind. You can no longer observe the moving arms. As such, how do you get the best out of a person? If you treat a person in a mechanical way, you will not get the best out of that person. Understanding the concept of collectivism will help the company, Manitoba or Winnipeg, also get the best out of the employees. In Japan, how this will help the book? Well, if everything you do in terms of business is always based on human rule, having a contact with that person, and you have to have a contact with another person in order for you to do business, be aware there's a cost to that. Okay, in that sense, so it doesn't.
Sir, yeah.
Interpreting your diagram there a little bit in your talk, I think you're sort of giving us a modest proposal for today.
saying that a blend of East and West can be brought together into a greater emotional intelligence.
Yes.
And in the center is the circle that says leadership, and that's the sort of opaque area of your talk, and it's something I've been thinking about and encountering a lot of, this idea of leadership. And I guess I would say it's, maybe you're talking about blending stewardship and ownership, because we seem to have a crisis of another area that I'm addressing, which is governance. And we don't really seem to have a model for governing corporations or governing societies. We've got, loud talk over here, and we've got quiet, underhanded business over there. So I'm really wondering what you think about this area of leadership and how it relates to governance. And there's a lack of ability to find a collective to connect to. I think people have a hard time doing that today. At the same time, individualism is most people feel inadequate dealing with the situation. So I'm interested.
Since given that I report to a board, I have to watch myself. I have to really watch my boss and
I kind of talked the other day where the entire speaker kept referring to his boss and the board and everything else, and I'll put it in. It was very interesting.
I think the term leadership I use here in the sense that a lot of people, one of the things they did a study one time, and they asked people, how would you rate your leadership ability in comparison to the rest of the population? And funny enough, 80% of the people said I would put mine in the top 10%. Well, we know that 80% of the population cannot be the top 10%. But a lot of people like to think they're leaders. So I put the term leaders because it's a term that a lot of people like to believe that they are in a sense. But emotional intelligence is not just about good leadership, it's about being good athletes, good musicians, about being a good husband in a good way, and so on. But I use the term leadership, and yes, it does apply to governance in part, because you're chairman or something like this has to exercise the quality of listening.
Is governance an ethical exercise in terms of the overall, or is it a decision-making in terms of imposing things?
I would, now I got to put a different hat because I work as executive director. I think it definitely relates to ethics more than it relates to the fact of making a decision. If you hire yourself a good CEO, a good president, that's their role to take a decision and make it a day-to-day decision. Governance to me is more about the framework, about how within which we operate, how we operate, and what we can and cannot do, but not in the decision-making role.
So what makes a good leader and a bad leader?
So you're saying you're telling
too much time.
You're saying
I wanted to say that quickly.
you're saying Attila the Hun wasn't a good leader. I mean, I'd say you haven't moralized. Suddenly now you're moralizing this term leader, whereas you could.
I'm not saying that Attila the Hun was not a good leader. He was able to lead his people because he made his people believe in certain things. Now, we cannot use today's standards by which we judge things to judge the past. That's for sure.
Well, then the CEOs who got all caught, they just should have been more careful. If you evaluate in terms of Attila the Hun, they should have just been more careful.
Talking about Enron?
Well, it could be because Attila the Hun did not have what we would call today an ethical worldview. That it would be difficult to, from the outside, to pronounce him to be a virtuous or ethical leader. But I think there we get back to a distinction he made earlier, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And I think one can be efficient without being effective, and that's a very unfortunate thing, because efficiency is effectiveness with a short-term vision. You add a longer-term vision to efficiency, and maybe it can, if you're lucky, it can become effectiveness. I'm sorry, we have some more hands here. Can we, sir?
What I wanted to ask, from your experience, first of all, as a premise, North American companies, in particular American, have had a lot of problems with governance. And
The governance, okay, the Asian governance. They have a different structure. The Chinese companies is more like a hub and spoke, where the center is the boss and that's it. Okay? They compare very much detail as the French companies, much more. Okay? They don't have a board of governance like we have, as we understand right here. The Japanese companies, they don't have also a governance in the same way because it's governed by a keiretsu, okay, which is a dissociation with banks and suppliers in manufacturing. So they are not necessarily comparable. If we look at the structure per se, in terms of governance here, it is not comparable. So it's pretty hard to answer that because it's very structured very different.
Structure's so different.
Yeah.
So, ma'am?
I was just interested in the fact that when you talked about Japan, you didn't mention the fact the American involvement in setting up the current system in Japan. And some of your comments, the questions about the Japanese, looking at some of these ways that we run corporations here and using those to benefit them, their structures, is still, the underlying premise is to benefit it in a capitalist model in terms of raising profit share and that kind of thing. So I was wondering if you looked at that at all in terms of Japan and the American involvement in setting up the system the way it is now, post-war.
You're talking about post-war.
Yeah.
But you're talking about political system. American involvement was in the political system, not the corporate system.
Yeah, but I think you do see the influences now in the areas you're talking about that they could borrow are very much about corporate, involving the bottom line financially, not so much increasing the law. I was just interested, when you talked about Vancouver and the prairies, and maybe there are places in the prairies that aren't as multicultural that could learn more from this. I spent 2 years living in Japan, and I felt over there I saw far more people still having these aha moments of learning about Western culture than I see in Western culture here, people having aha moments of understanding Eastern culture. So I felt like I saw the reverse. Though we are a multicultural city here, I don't see a lot still, we're still very much dominated by a Western way of doing business. I see Chinese Canadians in Vancouver working with other Chinese Canadians. There's the beginnings of partnerships, but we're still, in our infancy, I would say. And I see a lot of growth in Japan. You look at the youth there, completely adopting Western cultures and attitudes and outlooks. And you brought up, the first 12 years of your life are these formative years. I taught in education over there and watched children absorbing American television, American ideas and ways of doing
You have
things.
to be careful though when you say adopting Western ways. Like because I do judo doesn't mean I'm Japanese. Okay? Because I eat McDonald's doesn't mean I'm American. Okay? There's a difference between what you consume and the values you espouse. Okay? When I look at the Japanese on Robson Street, I find it still very Japanese.
Oh, I wouldn't disagree with that, but
Yeah.
I think where we're going in the future is what really interests me in terms of what does this mean, for us as a multicultural city.
Two things, and then we'll take a couple more questions that we got to call it with. One, what the senior generation in Japan, the establishment senior generation, called these people that you're describing, right? They call them Shinjinrui. It's a new breed of mankind. They don't understand them. Second point, the whole history of Japanese civilization has been one that I've been calling for a long time now. Import, adopt, embrace, domesticate, improve, export. And the American, the involvement, this is a thing that's been going on just for a few decades, right? Well, if you count Admiral Perry forcing himself to Perry's black ship and so forth, 100 years. But this is really a matter of decades through the history of so many centuries of import, adopt, embrace, domesticate, improve, export. So and you add to that the Japanese, very profoundly Japanese belief that they are so different from the rest of the world that no one will ever understand us. I think you have something of a core of uniqueness in their mentality that would never make them totally un-Japanized. While at the same time, they've been evolving, for centuries and centuries and centuries. I'm sorry. Yes, Wendy.
I was just going to ask, when you're referring to mechanical order, whether or not you see any parallels in the Asian society of another set of systems, if you want to call it, or a system, and that being in nature, and if there's some principles from that offer solutions to Asian business that compensate for the inefficiency caused by the heavy relationship aspect.
Whatever it will be. be that system, it has to be adopted, it has to be evolved within their own culture. That, the worst thing we can do is the IMF, for example, is to impose an American way of doing things on the Asian countries. Let them evolve their own system. That's all I could say about that. Or else it will not work. It was tried. They tried to impose it on Japan. They tried to impose it on India. It didn't work. They're now trying to impose it on China. It won't work also. It has to evolve within.
Do you think there is enough around the system of nature and the beliefs that are from so long ago there that might offer some potential?
Oh yes. Definitely. We were talking at lunchtime about this hexagonal. That there is the mechanism of it there for it to evolve. Oh, yes.
We just have time for one more.
I was interested in your comments there, and I wanted to ask, my impression of Vancouver, and I'm a Vancouverian, I was born here, is that we are undergoing dramatic change, and we can't actually evaluate the impact on the economy clearly of this multicultural city. A lot of it has to do with because there's nothing, you can't detect the sources of capital in a lot of the non-traditional or newer communities that are growing in this area. Having done business in ethnic communities like Asian communities in South Asia, they have sources of capital that we don't even have a meter for. And the model of cooperation and everything operates in a different area. And I've been in the position of working with, sort of traditional BC business people whose market is being completely restructured, and they're so terrified, and they're so angry, and they're so resentful. And the other groups are just doing their thing and being tremendously successful. But there's no way to clearly measure it. Yeah. And I think, and that leads to a lot of problems because people have fear.
In the world order, because we're becoming globalization, they will have to find a system of transparency. I mean, in the olden days, you knew people, and you shake hands on it, and you knew the person. But now, it doesn't work anymore because we're too big. So they'll have to find their own system.
Yep.
Or else, you won't be able to get access to capitals and stuff.
Good. I'm going to call it into the formal part here. If you'd like to still have questions, burning questions that need to be answered, we can, I think, can stay around for a little bit after. There's just two things before I thank you. One, keep your eyes and ears open for the detailed announcement of our next forum, which will take place on June the 9th. June the 9th. It will be presented by Dr. Edward Wu. Dr. Edward Wu was one of the original founders of the University of East Asia in Macau, now known as Macau University. Okay, he's also one of the owners of Allied Holdings, which owns the entire square block across the street there. People who gave us what is now the Wask Center, used to be the Toronto Dominion Bank. And he's been very much involved in two things: education and in business, and dealing in both education and business with China for many, many, many years. His talk will be on a new concept of non-confrontational democracy. A new concept of non-confrontational democracy. And in this also derives, again, as a part of a book that he has just published. And he'll be looking more at the political dimensions than the corporate dimensions of comparing, contrasting, and then making some suggestions about American-type democracy and Chinese-type government by powerful consensus. That will be on June the 9th, the same time, 2 o'clock. And just a quick announcement, we have a really interesting seminar that will be given up on the mountain at Burnaby by a professor and the director of the Institute of Archaeology from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, next Monday, March the 3rd. He's going to talk on the emergence of Chinese civilization. The Emergence of Chinese Civilization by Dr. Qing Zhu Liu, Liu. I wanted to thank Al for taking the time and making the effort to come and make his presentation at our forum. He has seen me give so many times over the last 10 years a memento, a ballpoint pen with David Lam Center for International Communication on. I didn't want to confirm all of his all of his expectations today. So we have spies in the Lamp Center, one of whom has noticed, because he lives in the Kitsilano area, has noticed him jogging when our spy was on the way to or from work. And so I have an SFU t-shirt, which we